Well, I wasn't alive just after the war, and none of my parents were actually active in any of these work camps. So I don't have any photographs, but as a Quaker, I met so many that had been part of the work up here. And I tried to collect all the news and all the papers and diaries I could find. There are some pictures downstairs from one of the work camps, but not as detailed as Jonathan's. Well, when I was asked to come here, I was also supposed to be telling about the connection between the settlement movement and the Quakers. And the settlements from England and the US were setting up settlement houses all around England and maybe also the States. And they tried to alleviate the poverty in the poor areas. And one of the most well-known early theologians in Sweden, Nathanael Beskov, was so impressed by the work when he was in England that he came back to Sweden and started talking about that there was a way of trying to get people to work together. He was an independent, free-thinking Christian, and he was very much aware of the divided society. And when factories closed down in northern Stockholm, he saw the possibilities because there were empty houses. And he started the first settlement house in Stockholm in 1912, together with Ebba Pauli. In Swedish, it was called a home house, hemgård. And the name of the settlement house is Birkagården. And they started off working with it. And in his own house, he had a private tutor for his children. And she soon was involved in this work and left all other tutorings to go to work for the settlement houses, Herta Svensson. And I met her, and she was a very lively, impressing person. She was soon part of every work there, and she dedicated all her life to alleviate poverty. She was soon known in Stockholm as the radical voice for the poor. And when the tobacco company had a new factory, she was getting the job as a factory nurse. Later that was called staff manager. And that was through the first woman in parliament, Kerstin Hesselgren, who suggested her to that job. And she not only helped the female workers in the wide spectrum of social misery, but she was their voice in all aspects of factory life. They had no rights and no privileges. And we have to remember that the Swedish women did not have the privilege of voting until 1921, much later than in Finland, for example. I think it was 1908 here, wasn't it? 1906 even. And the rest of the Nordic countries. Well, Herta organized classes and lectures on hygiene, cooking, sewing, as well as on social awareness. And she organized childcare for the women to participate. These lectures were slowly getting rather fast actually, getting so popular that they couldn't be held in the tobacco company. So she started the second settlement house in the southern part of Stockholm, Södergården. And there were lots of people coming both to work at the Birkagården and to Södergården. Herta was later on the board for the settlement movement, and she helped to start settlement houses all over Sweden. She also had another thing. She started the stugrörelse, the cottage movement, for overworked female workers to spend a couple of weeks in the summer relaxing together with students so they would learn from each other. Many socially aware persons were getting involved in these activities and teachings in the settlement houses. Some had been in England and had met friends, Quakers there. And from 1927, a silent worship group met in Birkagården, the settlement house, every Sunday. The same people would also go to work at the other settlement house, Södergården. And a Swedish friend, later, she was from Stockholm, she took the idea to Gothenburg and started a settlement house there, Nordangården, where the Quakers met in Gothenburg for many, many years. There still are hemgårdar or settlement houses all around Sweden, but many have been transferred into being folk high schools. But one in my old hometown, Borås, is still very active. And most children, including my own, have been painting, dancing, singing, doing lots of things in that settlement house. Social awareness courses, street theaters, and senior university are all based within that settlement house. In another town where I used to live, Kramfors, the settlement house was started just after the Ådalen shootings, where military shot and killed some people who were peacefully protesting against strike breakers. The program was set up and was very much focused on social awareness, rights, privileges, but also on how to influence decision makers and how to get your voice heard outside your own group. Just like the Fogelstad group that I'm going to speak about just in a second. After all these discussions and coming out after a couple of years at the home settlement house, the Swedish legislation actually was changed, and it specifically says that military cannot be used against demonstrators in Sweden. And that's through the settlement housing. The settlement movement was and has been very much a part of changing Swedish society. It influenced quite a few Swedish Quaker women and others to start the Fogelstad courses in 1922. Elin Wägner, Ada Nilsson, Elisabeth Tam, and many others. And just after a few years, Herta Svensson, who started the settlement movement, was part of the settlement movement in Stockholm, and Emilia Fågelklo, a very well-known Swedish Quaker, took part also in the project to give all women a chance to explore how society worked and how women could take part in decision-making regarding themselves and families. These courses were given on a very regular basis and continued to 1954. The Swedish settlement movement, of course, had contacts with settlement movements all around Europe and the States maybe, but as far as I know, they did not send any volunteers out to work, for example, in Finland. But it was a base for many. It was the base and the connection between the Friends and the settlement housing, and they all took their engagement further on. The Swedish Society of Friends, the Quakers, were recognized by the international Friends community in 1935 and as an independent Christian society since 1937. As I said before, they had meetings on a regular basis since 1927 in one of the settlement houses and continued there until 1956. And the links between the settlement movement and Friends were very strong, and they influenced each other. Herta Svensson became a friend, as well as quite a few others, and they all joined into the work. It was Quakerism put into action, especially when you think about helping the divine within everyone to come to a realization. The Friends were dedicated peace persons, just like Jonathan was saying before, and they also helped as health and ambulance volunteers during the Spanish War, Civil War, and both in person and with money. And they also supported the work for the German refugees into France in the late 30s. During the Second World War, Wolfgang Sontag escaped from Germany and Norway to Sweden. He was very interested in ways of rebuilding of the society after war and conflicts. And in 1942, he started the Internationella Arbetslag, IAL, KVT, abbreviated here in Finland, the Swedish version of Service Civil International. There were work camps organized in Sweden during the war to practice, so we will know how to work together after the war. And the Friends and IAL prepared themselves for relief work and rebuilding as soon as the war was over. During the war, more than 70,000 so-called war children, sotalapset, came from Finland to Sweden, usually coming as unaccompanied minors in small groups, with their names as a tag around their neck. Although they were mainly Finnish-speaking, most of them were placed in Swedish-speaking homes, and you can imagine what a tragedy and chaos it must have been for the children. And the next chaos came when they were returning back to Finland, speaking Swedish, into their Finnish families. And most of them, but not all, returned to Finland by the summer of 1945. Swedish Friends, as well as many other organizations, collected food, fruits, and clothes and sent them on to Norway and to Finland already in 1939 and 1940. But these things were later rationed in Sweden, and the state did not allow any packages to be sent abroad from 1941. The only occasional exception were for relatives or for families of the sotalapset, the war children. There is a little story about these packages that quite a few came from the States and from other parts of Europe, but they had to go through the Russian border to Sweden, where there was a Russian person sitting, and he would only allow packages that had an American or a Quaker sign on them, because he had gotten food during the Russian Revolution in 1917 from the Quakers. So it's one of those small things that is almost lost in our history now. As you heard, when the German burnt and blew everything up when they retired, many, many, many people evacuated to Sweden. When I was telling people that I was coming to this seminar back home, suddenly they came out with stories I had never heard of, and glimpses from what it was like. Astrid Kieselgren in Uppsala, a Quaker, told me that her father was responsible for finding places for all the persons, families, and cattle coming across the border. They came with their belongings on wheelbarrows, hay wagons, and even beds, carrying beds where they placed clothes and children across the border. Another friend told me that his aunt, who helped families for the unaccompanied minors. And a third friend told me about her aunt taking the names of everyone coming. And she had told my friend and others about how the Finns came across, and she got the names, and they all turned around and looked back over the Finnish border and saw their homes and other houses being burnt. And when they saw the church being burnt, they all screamed, "Kirkko, kirkko, kirkko." And she was very moved about this. And of course, today, I can't help thinking of all the refugees coming to many places in Europe, including Finland and Sweden, and how many unaccompanied minors are coming, and how little we remember from the post-war era. When these families and persons returned from Sweden in the summer of 45, most returned to hardly anything, and that's the pictures that Jonathan could show. Well, you heard a lot about Douglas Steer, but from the AFSC, and together with Swedish friends and friends from IAL, they planned a Quaker center here in Rovaniemi. And it was to have schools, lunches, and giving away clothes. But it showed very hard to separate the different villages from each other, so it ended up as more of a general project. And there are lots of stories about the two barracks here in Rovaniemi that we were told about before, that was given to the settlement movement. And already in 1946, 90 schools were working here in Rovaniemi with 8,000 children. And the plan was that it would reach almost 50,000 children, according to the papers. And Sweden provided dried milk and shortening, Denmark meat and sugar, and the US cans and soup flour. And very quickly, also the small infants were included, creating lots of daycare centers. In Kittilä and some other places, there was a major task of shoemaking and leatherwork, and that must have been a tradition within the settlement movement because it was all over Europe later. And Douglas Steer traveled around in the States collecting money, mainly from the Finnish immigrants. One of the other well-known Quakers from the States that I personally have met, David Ritchie, was also working here. And he was the one of the first to introduce me to Quakerism and work camps in the States, in Harlem, where I worked for a full year. Friends in Finland, people or friends, Quakers, were coming from all around Finland, Sweden, Denmark, the US, and they came to build cowsheds, houses, daycare centers, and providing them with beds, linen, cookery, etc. friends and what we call friends of the friends all over Scandinavia sewed, knitted, crafted, and made toys, beds, and other things to be sent over here. Among those who were working here in Rovaniemi and the neighborhood, as I mentioned, there were Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, Germans, French, Dutch, and Americans. And I want to mention Jack Wright, who came just after the war through AFSC and worked here in Rovaniemi, and his later wife, Tove Wright, who came from Denmark, and they met here and married, and are nowadays living in Sweden. And Tove wrote in her diary, when I now interviewed her, dirt, 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 digging, mosquitoes, coffee with the Finnish farmers, and we can't understand a word of what they are saying, but they do speak to us. We can also mention Lena Sundberg. She was the wife of Per Sundberg and the Bigbyholm School. He died. He helped to plan the projects with Douglas Steer, but he died just after the war. But his wife came here and ran quite a few of the daycare centers together with others. Their son, Gunnar Sundberg, also came quite a few summers. He worked here, and then when his time was over here, he went to Germany to keep on working. Lena Bergman, Inga and Eric Bergman's daughter, she was later married Ekenberg. She was here working, and I have some of her pictures down in the room. Ole Svaning and many, many others came here to work. Many are not with us anymore, but I do bring personal greetings from Jack and Tove Wright and from Lena Ekenberg. When I was visiting Lulu Rauha, that you saw in one of the pictures, in the late 90s in Turku, I remember her and some friends of hers telling me how different groups were working in different camps, Finnish-speaking mixed with lots of other languages, not always understanding each other's languages, but together focused on rebuilding the Rovaniemi area. And they were meeting now and then, bathing sauna, singing and singing and singing in the different languages. There is also a note that I found that Anna Breitholtz, another Swedish friend, was already in 1940 helping with the Karelian refugees in southern Finland. And she had to go back during the war, of course. But she was a stern supporter of the work. And I remember her telling me about the refugees from Karelia also coming with everything on wheelbarrows and whatever. Gunnar Sundberg, as I mentioned before, he described his volunteer work in the summer of '46 as, it was lots of heavy work, but it was almost as a vacation because it was so beautiful with the midnight sun. Not as gloomy as when I worked in Germany later the same summer. Thank you.